Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work on my websites, catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter so that you can find out even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Brian C. Wilson, author of the new book, John E. Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. Dr. Wilson is a professor of American religious history in the Department of Comparative Religion in Western Michigan University. Welcome, Brian Wilson.
Great to be here. Great to be with you.
Now, Brian Wilson, what is your website for our audience?
Well, we have a couple. InfinitePotential.com will take you to a website that talks about the Fetzer Memorial Trust, which is also hosting a free PDF of the preface and first chapter of my book. So if you're interested and would like to download that, go to InfinitePotential.com. And we'll also be talking about the Fetzer Institute. And if people want to learn more about the Fetzer Institute, they can go to www.fetzer.org.
Fetzer.org. Okay, so InfinitePotential.com. I love that name, and Fetzer.org.
That's correct.
Okay, now your book is Johnny Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. Who exactly was John Fetzer?
Well, John Fetzer was a very interesting Michigander. He spent most of his life in Michigan. He basically started one of the first radio stations in Southwest Michigan. And over the years, he built that into a kind of media empire with a number of radio stations and television and then cable. And then in the 1950s, he bought into the Detroit Tigers, and he became the sole owner of the Detroit Tigers in 1961 and owned it until 1983. So in Michigan today, most people know John Fetzer as the owner of the Detroit Tigers, or past owner. But I'm a professor of comparative religion, so my interest in John Fetzer is that parallel with his business life, he also was on this intense spiritual quest. And from the 1930s on, he got interested in a wide variety of metaphysical traditions, starting with spiritualism, but also theosophy and Hermeticism and esoteric Freemasonry. I can go on and on. And in the 1950s, he became very interested in things like parapsychology and UFOs. So in the 1970s, he had a foundation, which he started in the 50s but didn't do much with until the 1970s. And then in the 70s, he decided he was going to start liquidating his businesses in order to endow his foundation, which today is now the Fetzer Institute. And the Fetzer Institute, well, we can get into that a little bit later on.
Okay, so you're on the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio, and our audience is interested in natural healing. So what did Fetzer believe was the connection between mind, body, spirit, and health and our well-being?
Well, John Fetzer believed that everything was spirit. He believed in a monistic cosmos in which there was a great central source of circulating energy that was emanating out, and that for health, physical, mental, and spiritual, we had to get into tune with this circulating energy. And essentially, if we could do that, we'd achieve high levels of health and wellness. The interesting thing is he became very interested, as I said earlier, in parapsychology in the 1950s. And so the Fetzer Institute originally started funding research in parapsychology. And that lasted for a number of years. But in his last decade, in the 1980s, his health began to fail and his wife's health began to fail. And so he started thinking more about physical health. And he never gave up on biomedicine, but he always believed that there was a psychic component to health that was being overlooked. And so he was very interested in exploring alternative medicine and holistic medicine. And so in the 1980s, he began basically investing in a number of research projects that had to do with holistic health and energy medicine.
Now, this is very interesting because it very much parallels my work as a medical intuitive. When I do a medical intuitive reading, I read the physical body, which we think we know what that is. I read the energy body, which includes your chakras, your acupuncture meridians, and your breath, your emotional body, which is the largest part of any of us, your mind, which are your thoughts and beliefs, and then your spiritual body, which is the eternal part of us. And I would agree with John Fetzer that, you know, many of the practices in natural healing, such as Tai Chi, Qigong, Reiki, energy healing, yoga, it's meditation, it's all about connecting with this field of infinite potential. And as we increase our personal energy, we have the ability to fight off disease. And when I'm doing a medical intuitive reading, the first thing that I literally do is I read a person's chi level. I did a medical intuitive reading yesterday with a lady who has severe urinary tract infections, and her chi level was too low. And she was, you know, taking antibiotics. And I'm like, well, you know, there are things that you need to do, but one of the things that you need to do is increase your chi so you have the energy to fight off these illnesses. And I said, find the best Tai Chi teacher you can and go every day. So,
well, with John Fetzer, the interesting thing is when he began his kind of metaphysical search in the 1930s, it was very intellectual. I mean, he started by reading books and going to psychics and going to mediums. One of the first places he went to in the 30s was a place called Camp Chesterfield, which is a spiritualist camp, one of the oldest in the country. And there he encountered mediums and psychics and also psychic healers of various kinds. But I think it was only in the 1970s when he actually started meditating that the connections really became real for him. And his first meditation practice was actually Transcendental Meditation, TM. He became very good friends with the Maharishi yogi and basically advised him on television and media and that kind of thing. And the yogi, the Maharishi rather, in turn taught him Transcendental Meditation. So he and his wife Ria began practicing Transcendental Meditation, and he found just profound effects on his life, both physically but also mentally and also spiritually. And one of the famous stories is during the 1970s, 74, he basically offered instruction in Transcendental Meditation to the Detroit Tigers in their spring training. And that was one of the first times he actually kind of came out in terms of his metaphysical interests. He'd been very careful to keep these compartmentalized from his business. But in his 70s, as he shifted from his businesses to his foundation, he really felt free to come out and talk more publicly about his metaphysical beliefs. And one of the first things he did in order to do this was to basically introduce meditation to the Detroit Tigers.
You know, what's interesting about this, Brian Wilson, is that, you know, when you are serious about natural healing and you study what actually works and you understand, you know, how detrimental stress is just from a pure physiological point of view. I mean, you can go through every organ system of your body and talk about what stress does to your eyes or what does it to your digestion or your lungs or your heart and so on. Sooner or later, you come to the realization that if you want to be healthy, that you better start a meditation practice. And as you stumble upon, you know, different ways to meditate, it helps to open up the connection to your spiritual self, which helps you to have this deeper meaning. Now let's talk again about John Fetzer, the man. How long did he live? What were his dates of birth and dates of death? And what were his health practices? How did he go about keeping himself healthy after all this exposure to comparative religion and other ways of thinking?
Well, he was born in 1901 in a small town in Indiana, and eventually moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and lived most of his life in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he almost made it to his 90th birthday. He died just shy of that in 1991. So he was 89 when he passed away. And for most of his life, I think, like a lot of us, he kind of took his health for granted. And it was only in his later years, beginning in the 60s, when he started talking about meditation in the 1970s, that he began seriously to think about what kinds of health practices he needed to do in order to stay healthy. The late 70s were very difficult for him because the baseball was changing during this time period. It was becoming much more commercialized. There were baseball strikes. It was much more difficult for an owner to control a team. So I think at that point, that's when he really starts exploring all sorts of interesting options. We talked about the Transcendental Meditation. Another thing he was interested in exploring was pyramid power. This idea that you can use pyramids to basically concentrate subtle energies or vital forces. And it just so happened that north of Kalamazoo was a group that was essentially building pyramids for these reasons. So he was fascinated by that was kind of a proto-energy medicine. The other thing he did was he was an early supporter of biofeedback. And he supported the work of James Hart at the University of California at San Francisco, who was one of the early pioneers of biofeedback. And for John Fetzer, he found this just incredibly calming. The whole process was just very useful for him. And he also liked the fact that Hart thought it was also a road to psychic enlightenment as well, that it was a way of leaving the body and accessing the astral body. So biofeedback became tremendously important for him, and he originally funded a small program in biofeedback here at my institution, which is Western Michigan Institution, and eventually that blossomed into the holistic health program in the College of Health and Human Services, which of course to this day is still doing great work and is thriving. Yeah.
Now, I want to just explain for our audience what biofeedback is, because there are multiple kinds of biofeedback devices. But biofeedback, one of the devices, there's a place called the Institute of Heart Math. And they have different apps that you can get. We had Deborah Rosman, the president of the Institute of Heart Math, on the Natural Healing Show. But it's a real simple little device. You hook it up either to your finger or your ear, and it measures your heart rate, and it shows you how you can control your heart rate with your breathing, with your thoughts, with your mind. And so one form of biofeedback connects to your heart. Other forms of biofeedback can connect to your brain waves. And they'll put electrodes on your head. I've had that done. Measure your brain waves, and you can see, real time how your thoughts and emotions affect your brain waves and how that translates into brain chemistry. So are those the kind of biofeedback that machines that John Fetzer was interested in, or were there other devices?
Well, in terms of biofeedback, primarily it was brainwave biofeedback. And this was back in the day when they had very cumbersome kinds of skull caps, devices that they put on your head in order to measure these very real but very subtle energies that the brain is basically producing. So he was really, during the 1960s and 70s, kind of at the foundational point of biofeedback research. And of course, biofeedback machines today are much more powerful and much more easy to use, so they've become commercialized so that people can actually buy them and use them at home. In John Fetzer's day, you actually had to go to a laboratory to do this, and it was very, as I said, cumbersome. And to produce the image and sounds, which is the feedback, which today is very easy with computer technology. Of course, back then it was all very mechanical. But he found it tremendously useful. And even at that primitive stage, he saw it, the possibilities of biofeedback were great and waiting to be tapped.
Well, I know that I have a colleague who uses neurofeedback, which is, again, measuring your brain waves, and to help resolve anxiety, depression, ADD, many brain disorders. So, because it all goes back to your brain waves. And when you have dis-ease or mental illness, then your brain waves are not going to be balanced in the ways they need to be. And then we talked about the biofeedback devices for the heart, which are helpful for people with high blood pressure,
right,
and heart disease. So it was interesting that John Fetzer, the entrepreneur and great business person, was interested in both meditation and biofeedback. Were there other forms of natural healing that he got into?
Well, he was very interested in the readings of Edgar Cayce, the intuitive, the
medical
sleeping prophet.
Yeah.
That's right. And he met the folks at the ARE clinic, the Association for Research and Enlightenment Clinic in Arizona, and became very good friends with the doctors there. And in the 1980s, he had a second heart attack, and he was treated by his local doctor. And then for recovery, for that period of convalescence, he went down to Arizona. He actually had a summer home down there, and checked himself into the ARE clinic, where they used a variety of treatments that had been channeled by Edgar Cayce, including castor oil packs and things like that. They were also, go ahead.
For our audience, a castor oil pack, it's real simple to do, and I recommend them for my clients who have pain. So basically, castor oil pack, you get plain castor oil, we'll get a plain organic castor oil, no scent. You put it on an area in your body that's in pain. So let's say you have a pain in your foot or a pain in your leg or pain in the side. You put the castor oil on the area that feels in pain. Then you put flannel or a cloth on top of that. And then you put a heating pad on top of that. And then you rest and relax. And it's a very simple natural healing remedy for pain. And it also pulls energetic toxins out of the body. So in addition to the castor oil packs, what else did the ARE Edgar Cayce people recommend for him after his second heart attack?
Well, they had already begun developing subtle energy machines or devices. And this actually goes back to Edgar Cayce himself, who also channeled a very simple kind of energy medicine device. And the idea is that the body, of course, gives off both the empirical but also subtle energies. And if we could measure these, for example, as the aura, and if we could measure these, then it could be used for both diagnosis and treatment. And so John Fetzer, who was absolutely fascinated by technology, I mean, he was a radio engineer after all, so he loved technology. And he loved the idea that someday these could actually be commercialized and sold as products. So he submitted to a number of treatments using the energy medicine devices that they had come up with. And this led to a partnership between the ARE clinic, excuse me, and what was then the Fetzer Foundation, which eventually would become the Fetzer Institute, to create the John E. Fetzer Energy Medicine Institute. And the idea was that they would do, they would commercially, they would test devices that would become commercially available over the years in order to become kind of a guarantee of the reliability of these kinds of instruments. And they also would develop their own line of energy medicine instruments. So that was something that John Fetzer was very, very interested in. One of the research projects he funded was a Japanese parapsychologist named Hiroshi Matsuyama. And Motoyama had a device that tracked the energy meridians in the human body. Of course, this is part of acupuncture, in order to measure qi at certain points. And so he claimed that his device could actually measure, using the empirical energies the body gives off, he could measure the subtle energies that are associated with them. And that, he believed, could actually lead to more accurate diagnosis and treatment of disease.
Now, for our audience, again, this work that John Fetzer was interested in throughout his lifetime, in our day and age, there are, for example, aura cameras. Now, what is your aura? It's your energy field. It's a law of physics that anytime there's a vertical electrical current, which you are if you're standing, you're vertical, there's a magnetic field perpendicular to that. And the health of your energy field, it directly translates into your well-being, your overall vitality, and it can be measured. And so, for example, here in Atlanta, I've had a wonderful young lady take a picture of my aura, and just from a single photograph of the aura, she could read everything that was going on. And then you're mentioning devices that measure your acupuncture meridians. Mm-hmm. And this is very helpful to have scientific validation of this work that's been going on for thousands of years. But one of the things that we know from devices like this is that if you touch a specific acupuncture point on your body, a specific region of your brain shows up. Mm-hmm. And that helps to validate when you have specific thoughts or specific emotions that activate certain regions of your brain, it corresponds directly to your acupuncture system. So, for example, depression affects your large intestine meridian. So it's one of these chicken or the egg questions. Did it begin in your large intestine, or did it begin in your thoughts and your feelings? Mm-hmm. So very, very interesting. So, but it sounds like from your research, Brian Wilson, on John Fetzer, that he didn't get into holistic health until his 60s.
Yes, it was very much late in life. And I think he was such a go-getter as a businessman that his metaphysical interests, which were tremendously important, basically didn't, he was working, 14-hour days. And so, like typical businessmen, he wasn't looking after his health necessarily. And so it was only when he reached his later years and these health problems couldn't be ignored that he really turned his mind towards thinking about the kind of physical, mental, and spiritual connections that make up health and wellness, and that he could basically use in order to improve his own health and his own efficiency.
So the advice that he received from the Edgar Cayce Clinic, how did that affect his health? Did he feel better after following their advice?
Oh, he claimed that yes, it helped to save his life. He was tremendously grateful for the treatment. And he really believed that it gave him several more years of useful life. He pretty well worked up until almost his last year. And at that point, he decided to, the foundation essentially was off and running and had a board that was working well. And so he moved to Hawaii and basically spent the last months of his life in Hawaii. Had a house on the beach and took it easy finally for the first time in his life. Again, this is his 89th year. And carried on his meditation practice. He had a psychic he was very close to, a man named Jim Gordon, who came and occupied the house next to him. He had a caretaker who was a meditator who practiced Surya Shabd Yoga, which is part of the Radhaswami tradition. And in the United States, there are variants of it, like MSIA, the Movement for Spiritual Inner Awareness. And that was tremendously important for John Fetzer to have that daily practice. And in fact, as Jim Gordon tells it, Jim Gordon was there in his hospital room as he died. they basically meditated together and recited the mantras as he passed over. So for him, the meditation was extremely important and basically helped his transition.
That's a beautiful story. Would that we would all be so lucky that we could just meditate. I'm always saying to clients, really change your paradigm and your beliefs about aging. What if actually what happens is you're just happy, healthy, dead, right? And you have this easy transition. So very fascinating story. Now, Brian Wilson, you're a professor of religious history at Western Michigan University. How did you get interested in John Fetzer?
Well, I study specifically religion in America, the history of American religions, and I'm specifically interested in new religious movements. And when I came out to Michigan 22 years ago, I started looking around for Midwestern-based new religious movements and spiritual traditions. And luckily, the area turns out to be far richer than I thought. I grew up in California, so I had this kind of California bias, which was thankfully proved quite wrong. And so one of the projects I did was on another health pioneer, a guy named Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who was the superintendent of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which for decades was the premier health and wellness destination in the United States. And he also invented, of course, breakfast cereal, but that was in service of a larger vision of a vegetarian diet. Dr. Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist, and Adventists take healthcare very, very seriously. So I wrote a book called Dr. John Harvey Kellogg and the Religion of Biologic Living. And that came to the attention of the folks at the Fetzer Institute, and they liked the way I approached Dr. Kellogg's life and explained how his spiritual and religious beliefs basically impacted his health practice. So they asked me if I'd be interested in looking at John Fetzer's life. And they allowed me to go through the archives at the Fetzer Institute, and I found an absolute treasure trove of information, beginning back in John Fetzer's boyhood days. So this was an extremely rich subject. And I'm very interested in how people put together their worldviews, how they construct their worldviews. And Dr. Kellogg was very interested in this regard and evolved over his lifetime. And John Fetzer was very different in terms of his beliefs, but the same in terms of the fact that he always kept evolving spiritually. So I found this absolutely fascinating and had a year sabbatical I spent at the Fetzer Institute and wrote the book.
Very fascinating. Now, whenever we write a book, and I've published 8 books myself, what I find is that writing a book actually changes the author. So as you wrote about John Fetzer and his interest in spirituality and holistic health and energy healing, how has that changed the way that you take care of your own health?
Well, years ago, I had a health scare. I had a form of leukemia, which thankfully I'm in remission. But after that, I decided, okay, I better start doing something. So, of course, one of the things I decided to do was to exercise more, lose weight, and watch my diet, and all the things you should do. But I also took up the practice of yoga, and that was tremendously important. Now, for most of my practice of yoga, it's been primarily a physical exercise. But I've always been attuned to kind of the psychic elements or the spiritual elements of yoga. So that's something I've become much more interested in as I study John Fetzer, because Fetzer himself was fascinated by the chakra system and the whole idea of Kundalini energy and things like that. So for me, it really kind of sparked a greater interest in the way this works and its potential for health. So I would say it's kind of deep in my yoga practice. The other thing about John Fetzer is, again, he lived a very long life, but he never stopped searching. And I think one of the reasons why he stayed, fairly healthy but very happy until the end of his life was that he was always searching, seeking out new things. He always had a very healthy curiosity. And I think if we can cultivate that, that's tremendously important for, maintaining our kind of sense of well-being, even as life's challenges get sometimes overwhelming.
I couldn't agree more, Brian Wilson. And part of the reason that's true, I feel, and I talk about this with my clients in natural healing, is that the vibration of the planet is speeding up. Now, we've all noticed that, even if you don't put it in those words. But, what worked 5 years ago may not work today.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to stay in current vibration. And all illness is slowed down vibration. We've all had experience with slowed down vibration. If you've ever been to a nursing home, the energy is very slow. If you've been to a hospital, it's very slow. So healing happens when you shift your vibration and when you put yourself in high vibration energy in a garden, in a mosque, in a cathedral, among loving people, at a comedy club where you're laughing your head off. You're lifting your vibration and changing your entire physiology.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the interesting things is during the 1980s, John Fetzer had built an administration building to house the Fetzer Institute. And the building itself is very interesting. It's a 55,000 square foot equilateral triangle. So if you look at it from the air, it's a triangle. And for him, this basically symbolized body, mind, and spirit. And it's basically embedded in the building. And so the triangle motif is found in a lot of different places in the building. And there are also other esoteric symbols. He was fascinated by ancient Egypt. There are Masonic symbols. There are beautiful, huge rock crystals throughout the building. There's a giant waterfall feature in the middle of the building, which is both for aesthetic reasons, but also to ionize the air. There's a meditation room. There's also a gym, and this was, an early example of an institution basically embedding, health and wellness into its employees' program. And so the entire building was basically designed to create a calming environment, someplace people could go, do their work, but also feel a sense of achievement and also calmness at the end of the day. So it's a really remarkable place.
That's wonderful. And where is the Fetzer Institute?
The Fetzer Institute is located just west of Kalamazoo. It's on a beautiful campus surrounded by a lake and woods. It's just a really gorgeous location.
And the Fetzer Institute, how does their work today channel into what's happening now in natural healing?
Well, after John Fetzer died, the Institute decided to go in kind of more mainstream directions in terms of holistic health. So it began funding programs done through the National Institute of Health, having to do with things like prayer studies and things like that. They also got into holistic health education. And one of the first things they did was a series of TV programs with Bill Moyers called Healing with the Mind, which was really one of the first times a lot of Americans heard about alternative healing and things like acupuncture. So that was tremendously important. After 9/11, the Institute really shifted its focus somewhat, still in terms of holistic health, but they really wanted to promote the development of spirituality throughout the life cycle. So they have programs for spirituality in children, but also spirituality in seniors and older adults. And these are, again, ways of keeping ourselves, healthy and happy throughout the life cycle. And then the final thing they're doing most recently, it does have a connection to health and wellness, but kind of tangentially, is a project to look at the spiritual roots of democracy. The nation is going through a period where we're incredibly divided. So we need to come up with ways of talking to each other to kind of lower the blood pressure, the collective blood pressure, and start talking to each other. So the democracy program is a way of basically using spirituality as a way into conversations about the health of our democracy.
Now, Brian Wilson, as a professor of American religious history at Western Michigan University, what do you feel is the connection between our spirituality and our physical well-being? You've written
Mm-hmm.
2 books about, people who were, Mr. Kellogg and Mr. Fetzer, who were pioneers in business, but also alternative healing.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think is the connection between our spirituality and our health?
Well, I really like John Fetzer's metaphor of energies. Going back to his early radio days, he was fascinated by the fact that you could pull in voices and music out of thin air. So he was fascinated by these invisible radio waves. But then he thought, well, they must be connected to a larger spectrum of subtle energies out there that are continually circulating throughout the universe. And I think that energy metaphor is tremendously important. And so we should really, as you said, um, uh, find ways through practice, through thought, through mindfulness, through getting in touch with nature, to basically welcome these energies in. And they're both physical and subtle. And I think that's tremendously important to keep us healthy and happy. Now, illness is always going to happen. That's going to happen. But how you deal with it is probably the key. And if you have these kinds of resources that you can draw on, this kind of hope through this kind of availability of energy of all kinds, I think it makes a great deal of difference in terms of health outcomes.
That's a great, great insight. Now, how did John Fetzer's spirituality help him to become more successful in business, or so successful?
Mm-hmm. Well, he believed that part of his business success, of course, was due to a great deal of hard work and long hours. But he also felt he had kind of the intuitive ability to make the right decisions, and really importantly, to surround himself with people who would work with him. I guess who had those kinds of positive energies to raise the energy level. And he thought of this as a kind of extrasensory perception. So for him, it was his business intuition was not simply, just a cognitive thing, but it was also a spiritual thing. He also used a variety of divination tools to help him make decisions. So, for example, in his early days, he would consult astrologers. He used the Ouija board throughout his life. He carried around a pendulum, which was just simply a lead weight on the end of a string. And he would, at times when he was unsure of his decision, he would pull it out and hold it in his hand and ask it a series of yes/no questions. And depending on which way it deflected, it would help him. It wouldn't determine, but it would help him, make decisions. So I think the divination tools largely confirmed his own kind of native intuitions, but they help to inspire in him a greater confidence.
That's really fascinating. And now, again, what was the meaning for John Fetzer of wealth? So if he was very in touch with his spirituality and very in touch with, as in his later years, were using spirituality and energy healing for his health, what was his definition of wealth?
Well, again, wealth was, as he always said, money is a form of energy. Yeah, it goes back to that root metaphor. And it only does good if it circulates. And so he felt very blessed to be rich,
Mhm.
to basically be able to accumulate his millions. But he himself lived a very frugal life. He and his wife lived in a nice home, but it wasn't extravagant. In a nice neighborhood of Kalamazoo, but he didn't have the chauffeur-driven limousine or the private jet. His food tastes were very simple. So he often thought about, well, what am I going to do with my money? What's the point of this? And he developed the idea that the money was only important spiritually if there were a mission behind it. And this came from the reading of a lot of metaphysical books, including theosophical works, that really emphasize that money and wealth was a great thing if you used it for the public good. And so that's what John Fetzer eventually decided he was going to do with his millions. He basically liquidated his businesses and used that money to endow the Fetzer Institute, because he had this vision that the Institute would carry on a 500-year mission to help catalyze the spiritual transformation of the world. And he knew, of course, he wasn't going to live those 500 years. So he wanted to get this on a strong foundation, a strong basis, which he managed to do during his last decade in the 1980s.
Now, you had mentioned that John Fetzer introduced meditation to the Detroit Tigers football team. Baseball team. Mm-hmm. My bad. That shows you how much. What do I know? What do I know? So the Detroit Tigers baseball team, do they still meditate regularly? And are there any other holistic natural healing practices that they continued as a result of John Fetzer?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not really too sure. John Fetzer really only introduced the Transcendental Meditation 1 year. And there were 3 or 4 players who took it up and continued to meditate on a regular basis. But Fetzer was always wary about kind of injecting his own spiritual beliefs into the baseball team. Although today, I imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but I imagine throughout the baseball and football and all professional sports, they take a much more holistic approach to sports medicine, and really look at the kind of psychic and mental elements that go into performance. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have a lot of people out there meditating, you have people doing yoga, Tai Chi, other kinds of practices, because we know that these kinds of centering exercises, mindfulness exercises, make for better athletes. And so today, I think if anybody said that, oh, well, so-and-so on such a team is meditating, nobody would bat an eye. And I think part of that is due to the fact that pioneers like John Fetzer, way back when, had the courage to basically introduce it into professional sports.
Now, what attracted you to Fetzer's life story?
Well, again, I'm really fascinated by the way people construct their worldviews. And this gave me an opportunity because John Fetzer basically worked his way through all sorts of different metaphysical movements. This gave me an opportunity to basically study each one of these metaphysical movements. For example, Theosophy, which is an incredibly rich tradition that goes back to the 19th century. And it's a blending of Western esotericism with Buddhism and Hinduism. So for me, that just opened up a huge world for me to study as a new religious movement. So John Fetzer was fascinating in his own personal quest, but I think it mirrored the quest of a lot of Americans during that time period. And most Americans, of course, don't keep the kind of records and data and documents and letters that John Fetzer did. And we also have John Fetzer's library. So we're very lucky in the case of John Fetzer to be able to reconstruct the steps he went through to create his metaphysical worldview. So that's really what attracted me to John Fetzer's story. Very rich in terms of sources, and gives us a very complete view of a very alternative spiritual seeker during the 20th century.
Now, Brian Wilson, author of the new book, John E. Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. Any final thoughts for our listeners at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio? If you could summarize what you learned about natural health and energy healing, what would you advise our listeners?
Well, again, of course, I'm not a medical professional, so nobody should take my advice as that. But I think people should be open to alternatives. I firmly believe that you should consult biomedicine. It saved my life. But in terms of kind of complementing your treatment, you should be open to other possibilities, and especially in terms of getting through kind of the mental effects of disease, the psychological effects of disease. I think alternative traditions and alternative medical practitioners are terribly important because they actually have the time to get to know you as a person. And I think that interaction, in addition to the treatments, are so tremendously important to basically pull somebody through a major illness.
You've been listening to Brian Wilson, author of the new book, John E. Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. You can find out more about him and his work at infinitepotential.com and Fetzer.org. This is Catherine Carrigan. I'm your host for the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. You can find out about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so that you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. And remember to keep yourself open-minded, like the very brilliant businessman John Fetzer. Take advantage of energy healing and you'll find yourself feeling great naturally. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.